Now that you've spent a couple of weeks in art history, you're probably worrying about how you'll ever remember all the art we're throwing at you. I'm going to make a confession. I worry about the art we're not going to teach you because we just don't have time. And Chinese art, frankly, tops that list. China has an unbelievably rich artistic heritage, and we're going to touch on it only briefly here and again in Unit 4 when we talk about Buddhist art. The College Board suggests that we choose one non-European region to study in some depth, and after some discussion, we chose North and South America. We could as easily have chosen China, but we both know more about the Americas, and we thought you had more opportunities to see the art and architecture of that region firsthand. But having said that, I still feel guilty, and I hope that after today, you'll see why I feel guilty. My topic today is very old Chinese art, dating from China's earliest recorded history, and especially from China's first historically confirmed royal dynasty, the Shang dynasty. We're going to be focusing especially on bronze artifacts from two archaeological sites, the Anyang in northern China. By the way, I would just say now, I think I'm probably mispronouncing a number of these words, and the Dui in western China, and you'll see the arrows here on the map that point to these sites. I just thought when you're going to see these artifacts, you'd like to see where they're from. I don't plan to cover Neolithic art in China, except just to note that China in this era produced very beautiful and really surprisingly sophisticated pottery and carved jade ornaments. The jade's especially impressive because jade is a very hard stone, so these carvings represent a really significant technological accomplishment for the time, and these are basically done with stone tools. Now, many scholars think that the Chinese actually developed bronze implements independently of other Bronze Age cultures. They took advantage of the kiln technology that their highly skilled potters had already developed. You see this pottery here. You'll also see some of these Neolithic geometric and especially spiral patterns showing up in the Shang dynasty bronzes that we're going to turn to now. These are perhaps the most famous Chinese artworks, the bronzes, the very early bronzes. And here we see a representative collection of the Shang dynasty bronzes. I'll talk about the individual pieces in a minute, but let me say a little bit about bronze, since we're going to continue to encounter this sculpture material throughout the course. Bronze is primarily an alloy of copper, tin, and lead. In other words, they're melted together. It was traditionally cast by the ancient Chinese in ceramic piece molds, which is kind of a unique technique. I have a really good online demonstration of how that method worked, and I'm going to show it to you, and in fact, you even get to participate. So I'm going to hold off on more explanations for now. Now, Chinese bronzes are thicker and heavier than the bronzes we're going to encounter in the early Mediterranean cultures next unit. They're also cast rather than hammered. We'll run into other cast bronze, but it uses a different method. Now, one explanation for this difference in weight and really often in size is that copper and tin were more readily available in China, and the Chinese simply could afford to use more of it. Most of these works were excavated from tombs. You may not be able to see it all that well, but there's a warm, rich, sort of blue-green surface on these works. It's called patina, and it comes from the natural oxidation of the bronze over centuries of burial. So what kind of society produced these bronzes? And this is, by the way, these bronzes are about the same era as the New Kingdom in Egypt, just to put in perspective. Shang dynasty China, and this was the first dynasty that we have a historical record of, was a highly stratified society. You had kings and nobles on the top, peasants on the bottom, but you also had a large number of skilled craftsmen who produced these goods basically for the king. But then the second, at least to me, amazing question, and we run into this in Egypt and in the ancient Near East as well, is why take such effort, spend so many resources to produce these incredible works of art and then bury them in a tomb where presumably no one is ever going to see them again? Well, the Bronze Age Chinese believed that the the king's right to rule. I've used this term before, and you'll hear it in AP government. The king's legitimacy, in other words, the reason others accept the king's right to rule, was based on his good relations with the spirits of his ancestors who controlled the destiny of the domain. Notice this is a little different than the religion that we've seen. We've seen appeals to the gods. We've seen kings as gods, but this is an appeal to ancestors who in turn appeal to the gods. So, and it was also the king's duty to please the great forces of nature, the sun and the rain that brought good harvests, plenty of babies, etc. To make sure that the gods and the spirits of his own ancestors would look favorably on his kingdom, the king made regular sacrifices of wine and cereals, which were placed in these elaborate bronze vessels and then heated over fires on the temple altar. To put it crassly, in Chinese religion, the gods had to be fed, and if they were not fed, they were not happy. Does this remind you of any cultures we've studied so far? We're going to return to that question, but I want you to start thinking comparatively. Okay, so with that introduction, let's look at some of these individual bronzes. This is a gong, or ceremonial wine vessel. It was basically an elaborate wine cup found in tombs and used for libation offerings. Remember, that was one of your vocabulary terms. It's a liquid offering to the god. Again, at the heart of the Shang era religion was the belief that ancestors had to be constantly offered food and drink or they'd get pissed off. And the food and drink was a form of intercession with the gods. If the ancestors were happy, they would intercede with the gods on their descendants' behalf. And of course, part of this was also the belief of the people making these offerings that their own descendants would accept a similar responsibility and offer food for them in the afterlife. One of the most characteristic designs on Chinese bronzes, by the way, is the Tao Ti figure that I've circled here. And we're going to look more closely at a drawing of this figure, which is very representative of Shang dynasty bronzes in the next slide. This drawing may give you an idea why some art historians compare Shang dynasty bronzes to Mayan art. By the way, Tao Ti is sometimes translated in Chinese, although we don't actually know what it meant at the time, as gluttonous ogre, hungry, angry god. I like that. To use a couple of your formal analysis terms, note that this monster is frontal. In other words, it faces forward. And it's bilaterally symmetrical. In other words, it's a mirror image along an axis that cuts it in half. Early Chinese commentators and modern-day scholars both agree that these Tao Tis have a religious significance and that the figure, probably a god that needs to be propitiated, was not a very nice god. Beyond that, there's a lot of disagreement, and we really don't know. One other note here, though the decorations on these bronzes are intricately beautiful, notice that they're static. This art does not tell a narrative. It does not reflect movement. In that sense, it's a little bit like the Egyptian art, very stationary. But it distinguishes it from some of the sculptural works we've seen, particularly in Mesopotamia, and actually also in Egyptian art. You think of the relief sculptures that tell a story. So here's another kind of Chinese bronze from the Shang dynasty. It's called a ding, and it's an ancient Chinese cauldron with legs, a lid, and two facing handles. These were used for preparing ritual offerings to the ancestors. The perhaps legendary Emperor Yu, he was from the Xia dynasty, which is actually before the Shang dynasty, and we don't have historical proof that it existed, unlike the Shang. But Emperor Yu apparently had 9 of these dings made, and they were responsible for securing his reign. Even today in China, some people believe that possessing one or more ancient dings is associated with power and dominion over the land. These are very, very sought after artifacts. And by the way, they're also subject to a lot of art forgery. Here you see another ding, and this one has that Tao Ti. And note again the similarity to Mayan art. Now, unless you buy into the theory that space aliens who invaded the Earth looked like this. And trust me, after reading up on Tautis on the internet, I can tell you that there are people who believe this. The resemblance is coincidental, although it may reflect some cross-cultural vision of what a scary god looks like. It's interesting to speculate, even if you don't think that aliens came down. Now, most of the Chinese bronzes were bowls or pouring vessels, but some of my favorites and some of those most valuable to collectors now were actually, they were still bowls. As you can see, this is a bowl, but they had animal symbols. Here is a rhinoceros. It's an animal that's now extinct in China, but apparently existed in the Shang dynasty. I liked this one, so I stuck it in. The College Board is often going to ask you to talk about the function of art in its original setting. And it's certainly true that one problem with all of these works of art, you tend to see them on a pedestal in a museum, but that's, of course, not how they were originally placed in a tomb. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has put together a number of its bronze Shang Dynasty vessels in an actual ceremonial altar, reconstructing the way they were found on tombs. I just think this is interesting. You have more of a sense of the function of these vessels, basically as instruments for offering food and drink sacrifices to the gods. Now, remember I had two arrows on that map. We're going to move on. If we're still Shang Dynasty, still China's first recorded historical dynasty, but a different area of China, probably under a different government, at least a different regional government, and some very, very different bronzes. These actually caused an uproar in the art world when they were found because they turned everybody's notion of what Chinese bronzes of this era looked like. It's hard to tell from the slide, but the bronze and by the way, these are from, this is the one, Shang and Zhou. I'm probably not pronouncing that right. My apologies. It's hard to tell from the slide, but the bronze statue on the left is actually more than 8 feet tall. Unlike the other bronzes we've seen today, it depicts a human figure, although it's a highly stylized human figure, maybe even somewhat abstract, and we don't really know what the significance is of this very long geometric body, strangely shaped face. We do see that this figure seems to be also offering something to the gods in a bowl. That is consistent across them. Now, the mask on the right does not appear in your textbook, but in fact, many of the artifacts found at this particular site were masks. Scholars think they were used in ceremonies where the participants not only called upon their ancestors, but perhaps pretended to be their ancestors, imitated them in some way. By the way, we see this in the Egyptian festivals where the priests would reenact encounters between humans and the gods. And we see something similar in Native American cultures of the Southwest, the Navajo and Pueblo in particular. Many of those ceremonies involve evoking the ancestors by acting out ancestral encounters. So even though the style of these bronzes is very different, their function seems to have been largely the same. They served religious purposes. They were used to appeal directly to ancestors who were the intermediaries, a little bit in some ways like saints in the Catholic Church, intermediaries who intervened with the gods. Now, after the Shang dynasty came the Zhou dynasty. It's actually pronounced Zhou, I'm told, even though it's spelled Zhou. The Shang dynasty, as I mentioned before, was highly hierarchical and feudal. The Zhou dynasty wasn't egalitarian, but it actually overthrew the Shang dynasty partly on the argument, at least its argument for legitimacy, that Shang dynasty was no longer ruling in the interests of the people. The Zhou dynasty was more willing to allow people to rise through merit. This system of promotion through merit, and including exams, became very important to China in later years. It was also more of a merchant culture. In this way, it was more like Mesopotamia, traded widely and produced more goods for trades, and more goods, I wouldn't say for ordinary people, but at least for wealthy people who were not kings. One manifestation of this shift was the production of goods such as these bells, which were musical instruments. By the way, we'll see bells also in Japanese art. It was a very common use of bronze, actually all around the world. But in other words, in this period, people other than kings began acquiring bronzes. This is not bronze, but it's another Zhou dynasty piece and another important artifact of Chinese art. This is a bead disc. This was really a continuation of the Neolithic custom, which I just showed you in the very first or second slide, of burying jade objects with the dead. And these discs may have symbolized the circle of heaven, but what's particularly notable is that they're decorated with dragons, which become very characteristic of Chinese art. The Chinese revered dragons because they were thought to be spirits that move back and forth between heaven and earth, which of course is kind of what the Chinese are attempting to do with these offerings, is to reach the gods through appealing to their ancestors through their tombs. Just a little piece of trivia, the design on the reverse side of the medals given in the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing was based on bead discs. Well, the Zhou dynasty ended in a period of turmoil that's actually called the Warring States period in Chinese history. A bunch of competing lords basically duke it out to control China, and the head of the Qin dynasty, yes, that is apparently how Qin is pronounced, wins out. He conquers all his rivals. He established a centralized bureaucracy and rule of law, a little bit like Hammurabi's laws, brutal, harsh, but rule of law and enforced. This emperor gets a lot of bad press, but he's also respected for having created a strong state. He has a different burial custom. And these, by the way, were only discovered in the 1970s, and they rocked the art world. I can remember when these were found. He was buried with a huge life-size terracotta army. Rather than feeding the ancestors, he was going into the afterlife prepared to fight his way out if necessary. This is a very different kind of burial good, and it's also made of terracotta. That is clay, not bronze. And we're going to talk about terracotta sculptures in the next lecture when we look at Japanese terracotta warriors. Here you get this is just a sense of what the people who uncovered these giant tubes actually found. Keep in mind that these are full-size or larger than full-size. It would have taken an army of sculptors to create this army for burial, this terracotta army. More evidence of a well-organized bureaucratic state and craftsmen that are essentially organized into large guilds with a lot of quality control, although it's interesting that the individual features of these warriors vary, so it's not cookie cutter. Here you see one of the individual warriors. Again, just to give you more of a feeling of what these members of this terracotta army looked like. Let's just close by thinking about similarities between Chinese, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian burial goods. Now, I'm going to go back to this topic in my last lecture, partly to prepare you for your first 30-minute essay, which is always a comparative topic. But some comparisons that struck me is that in all of these cultures, the owners, and usually the royalty, displayed their power and wealth and their heirs' power and wealth by burying objects of huge value. I mean, that's actually difficult, I think, for us to understand. I mean, maybe we bury people with their wedding rings, but not with huge parts of their estate. So it's a different view of the afterlife, the usefulness of these goods, and of how we look after artifacts, works of art. The bronzes, like the Ur vessels, were found in tombs with human sacrifices. Not only were goods going with the dead to serve them in the afterlife, and in the case of the Chinese, to appease the ancestors, but people were sacrificed to serve them. Again, evidence of a very hierarchical society, a lack of value being placed on people who weren't, the top of the heap, if you will. These funerary objects were not standalone sculptures. They were not meant to be in museums. They were put in groups with a very deliberate function, sometimes intended to tell a story. But above all, they all reflect a belief in an afterlife and in the power of art objects to in some way equip the dead for the afterlife. In our next lecture, we're going to finish this up by looking at some funerary and power sculpture from early Japan and then actually from 19th century Africa, and then we'll be moving on to our unit test.